Hello everyone, and welcome to Vitality Speaker Series, our monthly webinar about bigger picture issues and what they might mean for financial advisors. I'm Adam Saville, Intermediary Editor for Vitality. So thanks so much for joining us on this beautiful sunny morning in London. And today we've got another excellent session lined up. But before I introduce the wonderful Dr. David Hamilton, I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a bit about what we've got lined up for our spring-summer programme. So kicking off next month with Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, probably the UK's most successful Paralympian of all time. We'll be exploring health inequality in the UK, the role of sport and physical activity in the community, and social prescribing. Then, during Mental Health Awareness Week in May, I'll be in conversation with television personality Simon Thomas, who, after suddenly losing his first wife to leukemia, was able to claim on a life insurance policy, and that was what allowed him to have the space that he needed, then the headspace too that he needed to deal with his grief and look after his young son. We'll also be hearing about how his financial advisor played a pivotal role in his recovery. Then, to close the spring-summer programme, we've got the excellent Peter Komalafi on board to dig into the cost of living crisis and how financial advisors can help their clients get more from their money in the current economic climate. So that's a really special series lined up, I'm sure you'll agree. So please keep your eye out for email updates or visit the Vitality Advisor website to register your place. Now on to today's session. So ill health prevention is a massive priority for us at Vitality because it's good for everyone and it helps bring down the need for claims. But what do we really mean by prevention? Today's guests will help us understand this from a neuroscientific level. So author Dr. David Hamilton has written books such as The 5 Side Effects of Kindness, Why Woo-Woo Works, which explores some of the science behind practices such as meditation and Reiki. And as for his medical background, well, I think I'll leave that to him to explain, because it's such an interesting story. So welcome, David. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Adam. It's a real pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm so excited to chat with you this morning.
Are you dialing in from sunny Scotland?
I am, and surprisingly, it really is sunny Scotland this morning. I don't usually say sunny Scotland, but really today it's beautiful. And I live in Dunblane, central Scotland, and it's really glorious this morning.
Magic. So as I said, you've got a really interesting background, and we'll come to some of the themes that you deal with in your books and some of the talks that you do, which I've been lucky enough to see myself. But let's start with your medical background and why you are doing what you do today. Let's go back to the start. I believe that you had a background in pharmaceuticals, correct?
Yeah. So I actually, my background is what's called organic chemistry, which is nothing to do with organic food. It's like adults who play with Lego blocks, but instead of using plastic building blocks to assemble shapes, we use atomic building blocks, so carbons and hydrogens and nitrogens. But the idea is the same, but what we assemble is medicines and drugs. So I worked with AstraZeneca, actually, and I was building drugs for cardiovascular disease and cancer. But you know what really fascinated me was the placebo effect, because in some of the drug trials, I thought it was fascinating just how many people would make real physical improvements on placebos. And you know, the conventional wisdom at the time, when I asked a lot of colleagues, even senior colleagues who'd been in the industry a long time, the conventional idea was that people who improve on placebo, that would just have happened anyway. But that's actually not true. So what I did, I think what most scientists tend to do is you're intrigued by something, so you investigate it a little bit deeper. So I started to look into the placebo effect, and it turns out that, you know, when you believe something, then your belief itself actually fiddles around with your brain chemistry. And you know, for example, if I was to take a painkiller and I would then expect something to happen, so I would expect a reduction in pain. So what happens is that expectation, let's say it was a placebo, but I thought it was a real painkiller, then that expectation itself causes my brain to produce what it needs to produce to meet that expectation. And in this case, my brain would actually produce its own version of morphine. And so when I uncovered that, and that was actually published in some really high-level academic journals, and I thought, nobody knows about this kind of stuff. I mean, and I mean no one, other than a very small group of specialist researchers in the field. No one else knows about it. And I asked my colleagues, and they thought they'd never heard of it. And some of them thought it was like woo-woo, no way could your mind possibly impact your body, because the idea sounded to them absolutely preposterous, particularly because we're working in a pharmaceutical environment. The idea of a mind-body connection was, you know, off the wall kind of thing. So without really talking much to my colleagues, I just secretly started researching it in the background, and it was so compelling for me, the amount of data available that no one knew about, that I decided, you know what, I love teaching and educating, much more so than being at a laboratory bench. So I decided after about 4 or 5 years just to leave the industry and start writing books and educating people about, you know, different ways of harnessing this connection between the mind and the body to, I guess, to optimize our health and well-being.
It's a really massive idea, isn't it? And it doesn't surprise me that pharmaceutical companies might not necessarily want people to know all this information, right? But look, we'll dig into the kind of I mean, there are ethical questions around kind of using placebo to treat people, and actually for understandable reasons, that's not a good idea. But what I think was so fascinating about your work, Dr. David, is that it, you know, learning about this stuff, you know, having a better understanding of it can help us, can empower us even to take better care of ourselves. And I think different people respond to different things, right? So some people need the science to really understand. You know, we'll come on to the kind of the benefits of meditation, for example, and other sort of practices later on. But other people kind of like see it as kind of like a nice holistic spiritual. It's often called, you know, often referred to as New Age, right? These kind of ideas. And there's and actually, I personally kind of I find both interesting. It's like, you know, we can all benefit from some kind of mindfulness and therapy, and if that makes us feel calmer and less stressed, brilliant. But I also think the science and what you talk about and what you educate people about is crucial to understanding it. So what was it about this that gave you such a light bulb moment? Because it kind of was really, it really has kind of, it was like an epiphany for you in a way, in the sense that it kind of, you completely changed your career path after learning about seeing the material impact of placebo.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the actual real underlying triggers for me, I think what drew me to the research was, you know, when I was a young teenager, from 11, you know, I guess from 6 years old, but when I started to really notice it, my mum had postnatal depression, postpartum as they call it in other countries, when my youngest sister was born in mid-1970s. And I, you know, what helped my mum a lot was practices that we now call mindfulness and things like positive affirmations. And so my mum and I often had conversations about the power of the mind when I was a teenager growing up. So I think having observed my mum benefiting, I think when I became an R&D scientist, I think that's probably why I was so drawn to further researching it. And for that reason, I didn't stop just at the placebo effect. You know, because what the placebo effect is really just some hard science that demonstrates that a quality of mind, in this case, an expectation or a belief, has a physical effect in the brain, but also that effect cascades down throughout the body, impacting regions of the body that are accordance with where your mind is actually focused. Like if, for example, I have pain in my left hand, but not in my right hand, or let's say I have pain in both hands, but I expect pain to reduce in my left hand, then it will only reduce in my left hand and not my right. And that's because my expectation will only impact a particular region of the brain. And I thought, isn't that absolutely mind-blowing? And then realizing when I was diving into it, that not just an expectation, but even stuff that we imagine. I mean, there was a research at Harvard, one of the real big, you know, I guess phenomenal moments for me was finding research that was done at Harvard when they got volunteers to play a sequence of notes on a piano. And they did this for a couple of hours over 5 days, and there was significant changes in the brain. It's called neuroplasticity. So basically, the region of the brain connected to the finger muscles had actually grown like a muscle. But while these volunteers were doing it, playing the notes with their fingers, a separate group played the notes with their mind. So they closed their eyes and just imagined moving the fingers. It's called kinesthetic imagery. And they just imagined what it would feel like as if they were moving the fingers. But they also had their brain scanned every day. And when you put the brain scans side by side, those who played the notes with their fingers versus those who played the notes with their mind, they were identical. In other words, just imagining playing the notes with the mind hadn't just caused changes in the brain chemistry, like producing morphine, for example, but it actually changed the physical structure of the brain. And for me, Adam, that was mind-blowing. It was like, why do people not know about this? And I thought I became from that moment so incredibly passionate about, further educating this whole idea, but also, how we can harness it. What is it that the average person can do to have a positive impact on their health, and from a preventative perspective, but also even when we're injured, is there anything we can do to help ourselves?
Yeah, and it's kind of how does the brain perform at a point when it's under stress, or whether that's an external stress or inflammation internally, when the two are connected, right?
Yeah.
So it works, and I just want to pause there and just remind our viewers that they can ask questions to Dr. David Hamilton throughout the conversation, but I'll have some time, so please use the chat or the question facility, and I'll have some time at the end to ask David some questions from you on your behalf. But it works the other way around as well, right? I mean, I love this concept that we have our thoughts have the power to create our own reality, right? So if we're thinking positive, we're likely to feel more positive, but also if we're feeling negative, we're likely to this is going to have a negative impact, not just on how we feel, but also on our physiology as well. And there's a term for that, isn't there? It's not placebo, it's nocebo.
Yeah, so it's called the nocebo effect. Scientists often refer to, or journalists often refer to as the evil twin of the placebo effect. So where the placebo effect is really when you have a positive effect due to an expectation or a belief, like I'm expecting a reduction in pain, for example, then that's called the placebo effect. But let's say your expectation is negative. So I'm expecting something to go wrong, or I'm expecting more pain from this, then we call that the nocebo effect. But the way it works in the brain is largely the same. So with the placebo effect, let's say I expected a reduction in pain, then my brain does what it has to do to meet that expectation. In this case, it produces its own morphine, which is called an endogenous opiate. But if I expect something to be more painful, then my brain also meets that expectation by blocking the production of morphine, and also elevating a little particular substance, a hormone that you often find in the gut that plays a role in pain. And what happens then is there is intensification in pain. But what's caused the intensification is my expectation that's fiddled around with two very important chemical level or hormone levels inside the brain and inside the gut that's elevated the pain. So I guess why it's called the evil twin is if you have a positive expectation, then we understand there is a process in the brain and the body that will meet that expectation. But as you say, Adam, there's also a process in the brain and body that can and often does meet our negative expectations. Fortunately, the negative side can only really produce symptoms, and it won't really create a disease, for example, but it certainly can, create what you said, inflammation and things like free radicals, which in the long term can build up, through stress, for example, and generate more serious consequences further down the line.
So does that mean, David, that we can effectively think ourselves well?
In many ways, I know it sounds really out there to do so, but we're actually doing it all the time. We're thinking ourselves well and we're thinking ourselves sick. I mean, not severely, but what I mean is if that's your stable, then what we're doing with our mind is we're doing that all the time. And I mean, for example, see, even just when you feel a set of warmth and connection, then that actually causes your immune system to elevate. We know that because scientists have asked people to watch inspiring videos online, and they sample the immune system from the saliva in a similar way that the lateral flow tests work by measuring a an immunoglobulin. It's a type of immune system substance in the saliva, and they find even when you're inspired or feeling good about liking someone, then that little level actually goes up. Your immune system responds moment by moment to what you're doing with your mindset. What direction your mindset's pointed in, really.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We've had a really interesting question and from Tim Clark come through on the chat. He said, would you say that yoga and meditation works well with this? And we're going to really dig into that, aren't we, David, today, to sort of kind of like work out sort of what is really happening, when it comes to things like yoga and meditation. So yeah, how about we tackle that question now?
Yeah. Okay, so yoga and meditation, they actually generate what Harvard researchers have called the relaxation response. Now, there's a number of things that happen, but actually they did a really cool experiment with yoga and meditation, to be specific. And they got volunteers who'd never tried yoga or meditation. And they took blood samples at the beginning of the study. And then after, regular practice over a period of 8 weeks, and 8 weeks later, they took blood samples. And meditation and yoga had actually impacted 1,500 genes. Now, that's about 6% of the entire human genome. Now, I'm not saying here that we changed their DNA. What I'm saying is the way that when I say impact our genes, what happens is genes are like wee light bulbs with wee dimmer switches on them. And a gene will either turn up, like you turn a dimmer switch up, or a gene will turn down, like you turn a dimmer switch down. And so in technical term, it's called upregulation or downregulation. And what they found is almost 900 genes had been upregulated, and many of them were playing a role in the body that's optimizing the immune system, that's counteracting the physiological effects of stress in the body. In fact, the Harvard researcher actually went as far as saying this actually is evidence that meditation and yoga can actually slow some elements of the aging process at the cellular level. And at the other side of it, they actually turned down about 600 and I think splitting hairs here, 687 genes were turned down. I've got a very good memory for numbers. And many of those genes were involved in the stress response inside the body. Isn't that absolutely remarkable? From just doing yoga or meditation, it was a Harvard research, just taking blood samples day one after 8 weeks and measuring this significant change in the blood right down at the genetic level, which is really just a demonstration of what happens to your mind or what happens to your body when you're either in a stressed state or when you're doing a practice that trains your mind and body to fall into a relaxed and restorative state. And that's really what the study was demonstrating, what you get from yoga and meditation.
And that's all to do with the balance of our autonomic nervous system, isn't it, David?
Exactly.
And we'll come on to that in a moment, actually. I'd like to kind of unpack that for our viewers. But before we do, it struck me as well, we live in a very troubling time at the moment. We've had COVID, we've got a situation happening in Ukraine, just the news yesterday, the cost of living crisis, all of these things we're bombarded with, and actually, it's important for us to be informed and for us to know what's going on in the world. But what would your sort of advice be really when it comes to making sure that we don't overindulge in these negative information, which therefore triggers negative thoughts, which is inevitably going to have a negative impact on our physical state. So I mean, how do you do it? How do you keep yourself informed, but at the same time not too stressed by the situations we're faced by?
That's a great question, Adam. And actually, some of the solutions that I put in place are very much what you said a moment ago about the balance in the autonomic nervous system. Because when we're on, let's say we're taking in the news, but it's upsetting us in some way, or we're rushing to meet a deadline, or whatever we're doing in our lives that's, putting us a little bit strained, then what happens is the nervous system, the ANS as it's called, has two components. One is the stress component, which is called, the sympathetic component. And the other is the rest and regenerate or rest and digest portion, which is called parasympathetic. So you have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, when we're under that kind of stress and tension and processing world events, the nervous system begins to display a dominance of sympathetic, which is the stress portion. What we really want to do is find that kind of balance and exercise the sympathetic. So there's a number of ways we can do it. Meditation, yoga helps, exercise helps as well. But you know, another surprising way, and this has roots in our evolution, is to get out into nature as often as you can. You know, because one of the things that happens is the moment the human brain and mind perceive a natural surrounding, which might be trees or the sound of birds or a garden even, or flowers or plants, it immediately tips the body into a parasympathetic sense. And that's because, you know, for eons of evolution, our ancient ancestors lived in, you know, in natural surroundings. I mean, blocky buildings and glass windows is very new for the human genome. For eons of evolution, we lived in natural surroundings. When our ancient ancestors had very much parasympathetic dominance, the nervous system was a state of calm. So what happened over eons is that state of calm in the body became associated with natural surroundings. So that wind the clock forward to the modern day, the moment you perceive nature, the nervous system moves into calm. So what I do, as often as I can, even if it's just for 10 minutes, I get out into the garden or even out into the park or somewhere where I can just inhale nature, even if it's raining. And just because it does that a lot in Scotland, and I pay attention to the sounds of the birds. I look at the trees. I have a puppy. I take the puppy out for a walk, whatever I can do. But as well as the physical practices of meditation and yoga and exercise, nature itself is something that's available to all of us. And it, you know, here's a little aside, Adam. This is how powerful this is. Research now shows, and this is quite modern research, hospital patients recover faster in their mental and physical health if they are in a room that offers them a window view of nature compared with a similar room that has a window view of a car park or another hospital building. They actually recover faster in their mental and physical health because the nervous system is perceiving nature and it's moving to parasympathetic to rest and regenerate. And what ultimately that does is it allows the body's systems to operate more efficiently, like the immune system, the antioxidant system, the anti-inflammatory system. All of these natural well-being systems begin to operate more effectively. So that's what I do as often as I can to counteract the stresses of everyday life.
So if we do that when we're well, we're more likely to live healthier, longer lives, or more years in good health.
Absolutely, but that is where some of the research points towards.
So interesting as well. I mean, just to revisit that. So the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system is, as I guess, could often be referred to as fight or flight. That kind of
fight or flight.
And then the parasympathetic is that rest and digest. And finding balance between the two is what equates to good mental health ultimately, and good physical health in connection. And we can do that. And there are various ways we can do that. You know, so meditation might for example, balance us into does it trigger our parasympathetic system if we're in sympathetic?
Meditation is a really good example because some people I've got a little heart monitor, and many people have these nowadays. They're known as biofeedback devices, and when you can notice it yourself if you take your pulse. When you breathe in, your pulse will slightly increase in rate. When you breathe out, your pulse rate will decrease. So many people who say, I have a resting heart rate of 72, that's actually the average resting heart rate. You'll find that your heart rate will probably go up to 75 to 80 when you breathe in, and it'll go down to about 65 to 60 even when you breathe out. So what you get is an increase and a decrease. Your heart rate increases when you breathe in, it decreases when you breathe out. You'll be able to see it when you take your pulse, if you're sensitive enough. But what's happening here is when you breathe in, what's happening in the nervous system is sympathetic, fight or flight. When you breathe out, parasympathetic, rest and digest. When you breathe in, sympathetic, you breathe out, parasympathetic. Fight or flight, rest and digest. Fight or flight, rest and digest. Now, on a good day, if you're doing something like meditation or breathing exercises, that little wave looks like a sine wave. It's exceptionally smooth. But if you're under stress, or even if your mind It's so sensitive that even if your mind is pointed towards, you know, that issue I've got with that person, or I don't like that person, I have difficulty with such and such a thing, or that world event's causing me stress, then you don't see a sine wave. What you actually see is something that looks like the Richter scale before an earthquake, and it's all over the place. It's absolutely chaos. And what you're not seeing then is a balance in the nervous system. And what my experience of using my heart monitor is, almost the only way to get that into a really stable state is to breathe and notice that breathing is what you're doing. In other words, be mindful of the fact that you're breathing. And that's why any technique that draws your attention to your breath immediately puts you into that balanced state of the nervous system.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And one of the questions that's come through is a really interesting one, and using COVID as an example. Yeah, there are certain things that you can't control or avoid with positive thinking, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think we need to be really clear about that. We're not talking that we can cure all illnesses by having a change in mindset. I mean, this is not what you're saying, is it, David?
No,
what you're ultimately saying is that we can help ourselves stay well for longer by and so there's a nuance there that we need to be mindful of that can help us live a healthier life by understanding this thing. But ultimately, illness and serious illness can happen, and it can occasionally be unavoidable.
Absolutely. You know, all we're really doing with mind-body techniques is we're playing around with, I guess, risk factors. We're reducing risks, but reducing a risk doesn't take the chance of something away altogether. It just reduces the risk. Let me give you a good example that's perhaps relevant to COVID, not exactly, but quite relevant. It's over a period of 18 months. Scientists recruited over 700 patients who would, when they next go to the doctor's surgery for symptoms of what would be the cold or the flu, they were to secretly assess the doctor's level of empathy. And it was called a CARE questionnaire they filled out, consultation and relational empathy, scale 0 to 10. Now, those patients who perceived the doctor as showing high empathy, i.e. give him a 10 out of 10 score, do you know their immune response was 50% higher than everyone else's? And their rate of recovery was just almost 50% faster. It didn't prevent them from getting the cold, but it certainly optimized their immune response and helped them to recover a little bit faster. It didn't stop it, but it helped the recovery rate a little bit more. Now, the reason I'm using that example is because when the doctor shows empathy, it's not the doctor empathy that's impacting you, it's how that makes you feel. It's your subsequent feelings as you move away. I feel listened to, which is something that's going on in your heart and mind now. I feel good about that. I feel listened to. I expect things to go my way, kind of thing. And it's that's reducing it's optimizing the body's systems. It's not eliminating it in a moment. It's not curing it in a moment, but it's optimizing your body in a way that's helping your recovery be that little bit faster. So that was a really good point to make. Whoever asked that question, and Adam as well, that's a very good point to make. We're not talking about eliminating disease, but reducing, by optimizing our mind and body, that it helps us to reduce likelihoods and reduce risks and impact on recoveries from certain things.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And that was Michelle Randall that asked that question. And I've heard in the chat that apparently I've got a bit of a clicking sound on my microphone, so I'm very sorry if that's disturbing anyone's viewing. But it's so interesting what you're saying, David, about sort of how we are able to preserve our health by kind of having more awareness of this sort of thing. And one of the questions that's come through is a really interesting one, and it's how can you create the same effect as a placebo without taking a drug as a placebo? So Matthew Wood said, I'm aware that many beliefs, expectations are unconscious, and it's not simply a case of thinking positive, as the unconscious trumps the conscious mind. So there's two parts to that question, is how do we trigger that placebo effect without even kind of actually going through the whole process of genuinely believing? And it's an interesting idea about the subconscious there. It's almost like, well, if you know deep down that you're unwell, how do you trick your mind? How do you hack I know you've done a lot of work around hacking our minds into thinking ourselves better.
That's a really fantastic question, and I'm really glad that we got that question, because it's actually surprisingly easy to do. Now, because the placebo is, you're not aware of something, the brain's changing because of a belief. Now, if you look at how it actually works, what you have is a state of mind that's causing chemical changes in the brain. Now, if we look at research on visualization, I gave the example earlier of the Harvard when they got volunteers to play piano notes. Now, when we visualize something, let's say you visualize, I'll give you an example. Let's say you visualize the immune system doing what it's supposed to be doing. Then what happens now is, look at how the placebo works. The brain is doing what it has to do to meet your expectation. But if you visualize something repetitively, then it works in the same way. Now the brain does what it needs to do to meet your imagination and not your expectation. And then what happens is we're doing something that you might even call self-hypnosis. And self-hypnosis is what we used to call visualization, right? And so what the Harvard research on playing the piano notes showed is if you do something repetitively, and this is how to hack it. It's not just a one-off, I just believe that I'm well now. That doesn't really work, because we can't just believe something like that. The placebo effect is blind faith. We're not aware that it's a placebo. So the way to hack it is using repetitive visualization. So it used to be called self-hypnosis. It's now called visualization or mental imagery. And if we do it repetitively, then what the research shows is we don't just change brain chemistry, we actually change fine brain structure. And that's called neuroplasticity. I give the example of immune system as an example, because women who were going through treatment for breast cancer, half of them were asked to visualize in addition to the treatment, not instead of the treatment. Everyone got their mainstream treatment, which was chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Everyone got the same treatment. But half of the women were asked to visualize their immune systems as if they were piranha fish destroying tumors, destroying cancer cells. So in their mind, every day, for about 10-15 minutes, they visualized in their imagination, mental imagery. They created mental images of their immune systems as if they were piranha fish nibbling cancer cells. Now, what was amazing is what that study showed is even through cycles of chemotherapy, where normally the immune system begins to wane, it didn't so much in the women who were doing visualization. In fact, the scientists actually noted that even after 4 cycles of chemotherapy, the immune system was still showing cytotoxicity against cancer. Now, what cytotoxicity is a medical term for basically still destroying cancer cells, only in the women who were using visualization. Now, there's a number of similar examples in science that demonstrates that one visualization doesn't do it. To hack the placebo effect, if you will, which is just blind faith, blind belief in something, the way to do it is repetitive visualization. And what we have to repetitively visualize is a healing process taking place or an end result that we're looking to achieve, but it has to be repetitive. If it's not repetitive, then we cannot change the fine brain structure. It seems to go through this idea which neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, which is exactly the same thing that happens when you do mindfulness. We cause neuroplasticity in this frontal part of the brain. And what that really means is we are changing brain structure, just like you might change a muscle from working out the muscle. But with using visualization, we're changing it not in the front here, but in regions of the brain that are relevant to whatever we're visualizing happening in the body. So that was a brilliant question. Thanks very much for that.
It's kind of mind-blowing stuff, this, and it's I think it's gonna take time for people to really sort of let it soak in if it's the first time they've heard it. And an interesting thing that I would pick up on in what you said earlier, though, everything you said there, one thing I would challenge slightly is you said it's surprisingly easy to do. But actually, what you described there, for me personally, I can only speak from my own personal, experience, but that discipline that's required to spend 10-15 minutes every day focusing on what you describe as positive affirmations or those active thinking. I guess it depends on how much will there is.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Adam. Yeah,
I mean it's just an interesting point. But actually, somebody, Tim Clark made a really good point. He's back on the questions again, and keep your questions coming in. We're getting loads of great ones. But just relevant to your last point, he said, I was always told the power of attraction is a very good tool. If you want something, imagine it, dream it, go and get it. And that's exactly what you're talking about, really, isn't it? It's the positive visualization. And I've heard other examples of sports, professional elite sports people visualizing scoring, the winning goal, or the winning basket in a basketball match. That's quite a common technique within elite sporting circles, isn't it? To almost kind of imagine success, and it increases or evidence shows that it increases the chance of it happening.
It really does, Adam. In fact, elite sports used to do that without understanding what's happening. It was because of elite sports that many neuroscientists began to say, well, is there something happening in the brain? And it turns out, let's say, use an example that is often used, and I mentioned this in one of my books. Scientists got people to visualize the approach shot at golf. So it's the last shot you make before you reach the green. So they call it the approach shot. So you're like 90 yards out and you're using your wedge and you're approaching the green. And what they had to do is visualize in their mind's eye, not just before they do it, but in the days leading up to it, visualize a variety of approach shots and do it like 10 times a day. Visualize it 10 times happening, 10 times happening. And what they found is a dramatic increase in accuracy. Now, what was happening, the neuroscientists looking into that find that as we begin to repetitively visualize, we begin to sculpt fine brain structure, and that begins to impact the way the muscles are operating so that we begin to reduce errors. Some of that research began at the Lerner Institute in Cleveland, when they got volunteers to do that with a little finger, extend and contract, extend and contract, extend and contract for 15 minutes a day over a period of a few months. Now, at the beginning and at the end, they measured finger strength, and they found that after 3 months of doing this, they'd increased in strength on average by 53%. But at the same time they were doing that, a separate group of volunteers closed their eyes and imagined that they were extending and contracting. Again, what I called kinesthetic imagery, just like you would imagine the approach shot at golf or throwing a basket, or David Beckham did it, for example, imagining taking a free kick and placing it over and over and over again into the same spot, whatever you're repetitively doing. And amazingly, after doing that for 15 minutes a day, their finger strength had actually increased by 35%, and they hadn't even lifted a finger. Apologies for the really rubbish joke there, but they hadn't even lifted a finger, yet they'd increased their strength by 35% versus 53 from actually doing the movement. What we now understand from sports and neurorehabilitation from people who've had a stroke, who use the same technique now to recover faster, is if you combine physical practice with visualization practice, you actually increase the performance at sports, elite sports to basic sports, increase the rate of learning, and also increase rate of recovery from stroke. To use that example, a number of studies monitor people who've had a stroke, who are all going through the same type of daily physiotherapy. But in addition to physiotherapy, half of the volunteers are trained in mental imagery. So they have to visualize, for example, reaching for a bottle of water. If, let's say, they have impairment on that side, then they have to visualize mental imagery, the feeling, what it would be like to reach for a bottle of water, unscrew it, take a drink, and put it back down repetitively. And that repetition begins to train our brain circuits, neuroplasticity, but also impact the body. And what all of these studies, without exception, show is those who do physiotherapy plus visualization recover faster and more than those who just do physiotherapy alone. So much so that a large statistical analysis actually rubber stamped this and said this technique should actually be offered right away to everyone who's had a stroke, because it's so powerful, but it also offers unlimited opportunities for self-practice. You don't have to wait till you're with the physiotherapist. You can do it when you're sitting on your couch. It doesn't wipe out the stroke in a day. But again, coming back to the earlier question, it does accelerate the recovery, because what you're doing with your mind is physically impacting your brain and your body.
It's almost like a muscle memory, almost, isn't it, that you're triggering? I find that fascinating, and you've led me neatly on to the next question. But just to pick up on a point you made about free kicks, it would be great. We've got Johnny Wilkinson as one of our ambassadors at Vitality. He talks a lot about the process you went through to learn how to take the kicks that ultimately won England the World Cup, right? And I wonder if we should get him on the speaker series and actually find out kind of what was going on for you, with your kind of positive thinking in order to achieve that.
Adam, I asked Sally Gunnell the same question. I was speaking at a corporate conference a few years ago, and Sally Gunnell, the former world record holder, Olympic gold medalist for Britain in the 400 hurdles, Sally was speaking right before me, and she said that the winning Olympic gold medal, 70% is mental. And she said after a disappointing previous year, she was taught by a sports psychologist how to use visualization. And she said every single day she visualized the entire race, every day, not just a week leading up to it, every day, training her brain circuits, training her muscles. She visualized how it would feel to clear the hurdle. She paid a lot of attention to the last 100 meters when everyone's tiring, visualizing keeping her form. And she said, and she talked about this in her talk, and she said, look how I kept my knees high all the way through the last 10 meters when everyone else is falling apart, because that's what she'd been visualizing. And she was one of the first elite athletes to formally start using visualization practices.
That's amazing. So the question I was going to ask, based on what you were talking about with the stroke rehabilitation, is where is this being used within a more traditional health care setting? So the one that springs to mind, and you recently wrote your book, Why Woo Woo Works, and one of the practices that you focus on in that is Reiki. And I know that Reiki is, to some of our viewers, we can give people a quick kind of, so they might not have heard of Reiki, or they've never had it, or they might not be aware of exactly what it is. So we can quickly maybe explain, give it a definition. But I know that's being used within the NHS to help support cancer patients, for example, and for a lot of the same reasons that you've talked about today. So in order to help people kind of, just improve their recovery and to use their physical state to create a better environment for fighting cancer. So what's going on with Reiki? Often in the past it's been written off as your book says, as woo-woo, as spiritual kind of like babble, and it's a new age kind of thing. But what, there's science behind it, right?
Oh yeah. Oh, there's loads of really good science. In fact, statistical or meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials show that Reiki is highly effective for reducing pain, but also for reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety. Now, the reason why it works is a Reiki session puts people very quickly into a state of parasympathetic dominance.
And just quickly, David, what's involved, just so those who aren't aware of what Reiki is?
Reiki, so what happens is a Reiki practitioner will gently lay their hands on a number of positions around the person's body. For example, on the forehead, on the top of the head, on the shoulders, on the tummy.
Often without even touching.
Often without even touching. Some styles of Reiki use a hand touch, like a massage, just very gentle. Other styles don't have any touch at all. Depends what style you use. But what it does, the whole setting and context places people into a state of parasympathetic dominance. In other words, it's not the fight or flight, but the rest and digest, or the rest and regenerate, that's working. Now, what that research shows is that allows the body's natural well-being systems to work more optimally, the immune system, the pain management systems. As well as the statistical analysis, let me give you an example of Bryn Mawr Hospital in Pennsylvania. An example of typically what happens when people discuss Reiki. They were invited to participate in a Reiki study for patients undergoing total knee replacement. Now, they were very skeptical because they're a big academic hospital. It doesn't look good having a woo-woo therapy kind of thing, but they allowed it to go ahead. Now, the results, the pain reduction was so compelling that and so significant in those who got Reiki, that Bryn Mawr Hospital then created their own Reiki program and trained 10 of their own nurses to practice Reiki, who now routinely offer Reiki to all total knee replacement and half knee replacement patients. And so what's happening? It's often called the natural healer effect. And what you get when someone is doing a healing therapy, then the healer themselves is trained to enter a meditative state. So what research shows is if you're in a meditative state, what you do is you actually impact the state of the other person. So what you're doing now is you're putting the other person, the client as they call it, or the patient, into a state of parasympathetic dominance, which is allowing their pain management systems, their immune systems, their general restorative settings to operate more successfully. So it's often called the natural healer effect, which means that if a Reiki practitioner is on edge themselves, then they won't be able to facilitate any healing, so to speak. So you're not actually healing the patient, you're moving the patient or client into an optimum restorative state, which helps facilitate their body's own natural mechanisms. And that's how it's actually defined by even the American Complementary Health Association.
Brilliant, thanks, David. And it's so interesting to hear that now we're moving towards a more holistic approach which incorporates a mind-body approach, even within the National Health Service, even within more traditional sort of forms of healthcare. What about things like on a day-to-day basis then? What about something like practicing gratitude, for example? I mean, give us a few tips maybe. I mean, I can imagine gratitude plays into that, you know, a part of this kind of positive thinking. And what can we all do on a daily basis that will help us, you know, kind of feel better and then therefore stay healthier?
Well, Adam, I could give you a really, really good example. And one of the strongest is kindness. And kindness and gratitude are very similar.
I can't believe we haven't actually talked about that yet, David. I mean, that was, we've somehow managed to, kindness, your book, the five effects of kindness, right?
5 side effects of kindness, yeah. Yeah, well, actually, see, gratitude and kindness are similar. You know, you can be grateful for the sunshine today, or you can be grateful for, you know, that you're healthy. But when you shift your gratitude towards, I'm grateful for that person in my life, and I'm grateful for the experience I had with such and such a person, or I'm grateful for my dog, my puppy, or whatever, or I'm grateful. When your gratitude moves towards about a person and you begin to feel a warmth and connection, then it's the same effects you trigger in the brain and body as when you do a physical act of kindness for someone. Now, oftentimes I ask people, what is the opposite of stress? In fact, I'll ask those listening right now, just for a moment, think to yourself, what do you think the opposite of stress is? And feel free to pop it in the chat box if you like. But, you know, just take even 30 seconds to ponder, what do you think is the opposite of stress?
I don't know, maybe it's relaxation, right? Or calm, you know,
yeah.
that might be an obvious answer.
Yeah, that's the obvious answer, right? Now, in actual fact, relaxation and calm, that's not the opposite of stress. That's the absence of stress. Neurologically and physiologically, the opposite of stress is kindness. Now, what I mean by that, the opposite of how stress feels is how kindness feels. And therefore, the physiological effects in the body and the neurological effects in the brain are exactly opposite from each other. Now, when you feel stressed, it's not the situation that's causing the buildup of like stress hormones in the brain and body. It's how you feel about it. You know, two people can be in exactly the same situation. One person feels stressed, the other doesn't. Maybe the other person has another mindset about it or has a different experience about it, so they don't feel stressed. Now, the person who feels stressed will have cortisol and adrenaline swimming about in the brain and body because they feel stressed. Now, when you be kind, because of how that feels, you don't produce stress hormones, you produce what I call kindness hormones. And I call them kindness hormones really to draw a parallel. The main one is also called the love drug, the hugging hormone, the cuddle chemical, oxytocin is its real chemical name. Now, what that does is that has incredible effects in the brain and inside the body. In fact, in the brain, research finds that consistent kindness actually changes some of the physical structure of the brain in such a way that it makes it easier to access positive states like happiness and joy. You know, I think many of your listeners will be aware that if we practice mindfulness techniques, that, you know, you become mindful of your breath, for example, yoga or something, we cause a physical change in the structure of the brain that's akin to working out a muscle. The change in the physical muscle becomes firmer and larger. So the brain undergoes the same thing, neuroplasticity. But if we do kindfulness, so instead of noticing your breath, you're bringing your attention to, I appreciate that person in my life, coming back to the gratitude. You know, I appreciate that experience I had with that person. Or you literally go out and help people and connect with each other as you're literally helping someone in some capacity, then we also impact that part of the brain, but there's a slight bias to the left-hand side. Now, that's a region associated with happiness and joy. Now, like working out a muscle makes us more powerful, working out that region makes it more powerful, and that's a region associated with happiness and joy, so it becomes easier out of the backdrop of everyday events. It becomes easier to find the happiness and the joy. It doesn't mean you're enlightened in a day. It just becomes a little bit easier as your brain circuits become more attuned to noticing more of the light than the shade, so to speak. And at the same time, kindness hormones dial down the activity of that key stress region at the back of the brain. And what studies show is on days when we are practicing more kindness, then stress tends to reduce. It doesn't eliminate, it doesn't mean stress doesn't happen. It just means that because of how kindness feels, we take the sting out of some of the typical stressful events in our life. Now, if I could go a little bit further, kindness hormones also impact your cardiovascular system. What research finds is kindness hormones, oxytocin, for example, that's triggered by how kindness feels, just like stress hormones are triggered by how stress feels. What kindness hormones, oxytocin, does is it dilates our blood vessels, which eases the pressure on the heart and actually causes a net reduction in blood pressure. So kindness hormones are actually called cardioprotective, and that means they protect our cardiovascular system, which means any way of producing it, acts of kindness. Even think, as daft as it might sound, woo-woo as it might sound, thinking kindly, thinking why I appreciate that experience I had with that person. I appreciate that person's personality, the way they helped me such and such a time ago. All of those things are there cardioprotective. They impact the actual health of our cardiovascular system.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I think that's an idea that given the state of the world that we're facing today, I think that's an idea we can all get behind. If it's better for everyone, right? It's better for you as an individual being kind, not just the person you're being kind to,
exactly.
And making a positive impact on the world. We're into the last 10 minutes now. David, time has flown by. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I hope our viewers agree. We've got loads of great questions coming in. There's I thought this was quite an amusing comment from David Bassett. He said, "I use a standard joke that I cannot get ill or injured because I'm from Yorkshire. Daft, I know, but I've not been to a doctor for over 10 years. Is it working?" And another, Dean Taylor's asked a really great question, which we could definitely kind of quickly cover off. Which of your books should he read first?
I would probably say The 5 Side Effects of Kindness is the one. I think it's a better introduction to the concepts behind. I've written 11 books, but it's a good introduction. 5 Side Effects of Kindness is fairly recent, but it is a good introduction to the underlying concepts of all my other books, I suppose.
And a really great question from Keva Sudhaga, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. How do you deal with the situation that you're stuck in? So where a cycle keeps repeating and you keep finding it hard to find a solution, for example, with work when it comes to emotional, feeling drained, stress. What would be your sort of tip there?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of ways I approach that. One of my books is actually on self-esteem. It's called I Heart Me. And one of the techniques I teach in there is the importance of self-kindness. And self-kindness can be two things. It can be what things that you do for yourself, including, treats, taking time for yourself, but it's also in how you think about yourself. And a simple technique for that is to use a three-way dialogue between that think of it as an aspect of you that's self-critical and an aspect of you that feels wounded by the situation and the stresses in your life and by the self-critic, but also the deep wiser part of you, your higher self or your inner Buddha. And you allow a three-way conversation between those aspects and allow the inner Buddha to finish the conversation. And what that does, it trains you to think about yourself in a different way that actually gives us, by changing how we think and feel about ourselves, it gives us sometimes a broader perspective on the way things seem to be unfolding for ourselves in our lives. And what I've repeatedly found is when we go into that, which is a very important aspect of self-esteem that most people forget about, is when we deal with that, it seems to have a cascade or a ripple effect in the way in which we meet life in general, and we meet life in a different sort of way, which means the way we communicate with people begins to change. The way people communicate with us and treat us begins to change as well. So you have this ripple effect. It's not always the answer, but it's very often the answer, that type of exercise. I'm quite happy to email that a PDF instruction to you, Adam, to pass on to
I'd love that. I'm sure our viewers would love to hear more. I mean, it's such a powerful idea, that, isn't it? Is that if we are kind to ourselves, we're less likely to be impacted negatively by the negative things happening around us. And I don't think we've got long enough to really kind of fully unpack that, because it takes a lot of it takes a lot of self-reflection to be able to get to that point. So earlier on, when you asked the question, what's the opposite of kindness, a couple of people actually did submit answers. So Janine Burns said contentment, which I think is a really good answer. Again, I guess that's the outcome of not being stressed. And then Jambu said gratitude, which I think was not far off. And true.
Gratitude is pretty close.
Kindness, they're very, very interlinked. So just to kind of just to basically close things off, we've got pretty much out of time. Some great comments coming in. Brilliant, thank you from Dean. Kavya Sudhaga, to your answer a minute ago, said thank you so much. And Janine Burns said love this. Thanks both, and thank you, David. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. I think you're a real inspiration, really, and I think to dedicate your career to opening people up to these ideas and using science as the tool that you're able to unlock it, then yeah, I mean, that's surely going to make a positive impact on the world. Charlie Anderson just said she's just bought the book, so you sold a book today. So that's hey. Thanks, Charlene. Claire Montoni said, such a fantastic speaker. Thank you, David. Really fascinating conversation from Matthew. Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. I really appreciate your feedback, your questions. Let's leave it there, David. But yeah, as we've discussed, get more information in David's books.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks, everyone, for joining and for your questions. I've had a really great, enjoyable experience today. So have a great day wherever you are.
Thank you. We've just got a question in saying, is there going to be a recording of it available? We'll be posting this on YouTube for people to tune into afterwards. Cool. Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks, David.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Have a great day. Bye. See you next time.